Right, so first of all, welcome to the workshop and thanks for being here after 2 exciting days of Responsible AI Forum. And as you can see, the title of this workshop is Bridging the Gap Between AI Strategy and Policymaking. And the motivation behind the workshop is to discuss and also to collect an overall view of how the quite ambitious goals of EU AI strategy is to be implemented, i.e. what kind of tools for ethical evaluation and feasible regulation are there to realize the promises of this kind of trustworthy AI in Europe, and the process and what kind of processes can there be to bring policy making and citizens closer together. And we would really like to pick your brains on this, so it would be wonderful if we could have a rich discussion then after our brief presentation here. And there you can see the goals for the workshop. We will use 3 examples or 3 kind of perspectives which are already used to mitigate the gap between top-level AI strategy and local governments or governance, policymaking. And these are the kind of the initiatives and frameworks to mitigate bias in AI systems, AI-based solutions, and then new regulatory mechanisms for AI, such as sandboxes and the regulatory perspective in general, and then initiatives and models towards more collaborative AI governance. And so in some, we'd like to now discuss the kind of examples and your personal experiences, any insights, etc., about what kind of possibilities and also problems there are in trying to implement ethical thinking and feasible regulation for AI in Europe in different contexts of feasible policies for AI in Europe in different concepts. And maybe then possibly to come a bit closer to have some sort of an overarching view of this, so collect ideas and views and experiences and concrete examples of those. So please. And now to introduce the challenge, and my colleague Atte here will take over.
Thank you, Anna. So yeah, obviously, as we know, there's an ambitious digital strategy of the EU with AI, one of its central focal points based on kind of human-centric approach, an ethical one, which is clearly kind of designated as the European way of advancing on EU on AI. But obviously, there's still challenges, even though we've seen the AI Act introduced this year. There's obviously a variety of challenges we still face on how to actually implement that in practice. What might be the hindrances be? What are the key actors and gatekeepers one should try to engage with? And what kind of tools, processes, and methods are there to support the implementation? So as kind of a higher level thing, the way we view AI governance, there could be kind of 3 aspects. So we've seen kind of an explosion of AI strategies and ethics principles since 2017 on local, national, and international level. And followed by that, there's been a bit more precise policy mechanisms, tools, and frameworks in the last couple of years. So including things like AI impact assessments, audits, inspections, oversight bodies, procurement conditions, things of that nature. And lastly, in the last year or so, we've seen more robust regulation and legislation, such as the AI Act. So yeah, as mentioned, there's most of the EU nations have national AI strategies introduced and updated since 2017, 2018. And on the kind of commission level, there's obviously there's the coordinate plan on AI based around the 4 key policy objectives, and it's updated this year, more so focused on kind of setting the enabling conditions for AI innovations and ensuring that AI works for people. But more so, there's obviously the regulatory framework for AI, so namely the AI Act, which is based on which is based on a risk approach to AI. So assessing different categories of risks and regulating AI based on that, as you know. Won't go through this, but just to show that there's been an increasing attention to ethical AI in EU since 2017, and obviously different communications. The high-level expert group on artificial intelligence has been one of the driving actors around that, followed by the white paper, now the AI Act and other measures. But yeah, in our view, there's still some gaps to be filled. For example, looking at the kind of current values and assumptions behind the EU's AI legislation and strategy. At least the AI Act is rather kind of product focused. There's a lot of focus on data quality as the single kind of a factor that enables ethical AI, which might be somewhat misguided. And similarly, there's a lot of focus on kind of technical debiasing. We will somehow debias the data, which is quite a bit more complicated than that, one would say. And also, we think there should be a wider recognition of the kind of social technical issues around AI, and thereby enabling kind of more citizen perspective into the issue. So we think that there's a need for greater co-design throughout the AI and machine learning pipeline, so in different stages. So firstly, in kind of framing the problem, and then in the more technical phases as well, and also in the implementation and deployment phase, which is one of the main issues that is often overlooked when it comes to, say, bias in AI systems. The kind of local deployment is very much important, and accountability mechanisms are still somewhat lacking. So yeah, we have kind of 3 examples on how to kind of mitigate this gap between higher level AI strategy and implementation. So starting off, one could think of the algorithmic impact assessment. So the perspective we look at this from is kind of the bias and discrimination side. So obviously AI can result in algorithmic biases, posing threats to fairness and non-discrimination across society in wide variety of sectors across finance, recruitment, education, and so forth. And this is largely because of pattern recognition in machine learning systems across large data sets. And this is especially problematic since it can give rise to intersectional biases across multiple protected characteristics of citizens. And moreover, this is especially problematic for minorities, and minority communities who might suffer from racial and gender inequalities, and this is quite widely recognized on EU level already. And as you can see, there's some widely known examples at the bottom. But what we have started to see is kind of this algorithmic impact assessment as one kind of a tool to tackle this from the governance perspective. So there is now recognition that this requires some public sector standard setting, assessment frameworks, and possibly some regulation. But impact assessments are one mechanisms of kind of a softer forms starting to address this. Although so far there's only been kind of limited focus on issues such as equality and non-discrimination so far. For example, the European Union's Agency for Fundamental Rights has called for mandatory fundamental rights impact assessment in AI systems. And this can consider both kind of the negative risks of discrimination as well as the positive impacts AI can have in driving driving solutions for advancing equality, and this is also reflected in the in kind of our legal instruments, which do recognize kind of positive discrimination. And also, obviously, this can also take kind of the ex ante or ex post impact assessment, and also the AI Act now does require a sort of a risk assessment for high risk AI systems, although it's more so focused on kind of the data set quality and traceability, while not referring explicitly to issues like discrimination. So yeah, we've started to see these frameworks emerging, and there's already some precedents in kind of the data protection impact assessments, which already take place within GDPR. We've seen these in Canada, New Zealand, and AFRA, as mentioned, AI Now Institute, Other Lovelace Institute, and CDE from UK have also presented these. And as said, they can take place prior to public procurement or during the development or after in regular milestones. And obviously these also have some interlinkage with kind of more technical fairness metrics, which we haven't touched upon here. So kind of technical debiasing tools, but we'll leave those aside since this is more so focused on the governance aspects. And just as a background, where we are coming from, we're currently working on a project on avoiding AI biases, where we create a Finnish assessment framework for non-discriminatory AI systems, working with the Finnish Prime Minister's Office and the Minister of Justice. This takes place this and the next year. And yeah, the central aim there is to create an evaluation framework for ensuring non-discrimination in AI systems, based on kind of gaining a wider view of the systems in place in Finland and the Finnish legislative space. But yeah, that's just as a background. But as a general question, which you can think on your own as we move forward, is there something that you think should really be taken into account when creating such evaluation frameworks for more fair, unbiased AI? Because this is something we're currently working on, and would be very happy to hear any thoughts you might have on this. But with that, I think I'll pass it forward to Johannes up next.
Thank you, and good afternoon, and welcome to this session from my behalf as well. I'm Johannes Mikkonen, and one of the 3 presenters here in the same room in Helsinki with my colleagues. Yeah, so the another example of these initiatives that aims to bridge this gap between AI high-level strategy and then the implementation are related to regulation and of AI and other emerging technologies, and I will briefly go through the case of regulatory sandboxes, which have been discussed in this conference already a lot. So a couple of the points, like general, like how now we have seen the AI Act from the Commission, and we all understand that it's quite obvious that we like unregulated environment benefits only the bad guys, and we need a efficient and good regulation regarding emerging technology for sure. But it's quite complicated and challenging to plan and implement it in an efficient way. For example, there's the danger of both regulating too early or regulating too late. It usually takes several years that before any technology's like full potential becomes clear. And in the meantime, the regulators and policymakers has to work within existing conditions and frameworks and try to then mitigate the future risks. Then it's like AI-based solutions, such as many like technological solutions and innovations. They are implemented in any domains, which make it like the sector-specific regulation very challenging. And also there's a question if we should regulate the legal codes or technical codes, and in which cases, referring that legal regulation happens through monitoring and executing post-fact by public authorities, or then we can have technical regulation, which is placed within the code itself, making it very hard, of course, to break the rules in first place, and it's related to standards, codes and algorithms and so on. And then the challenge ex post based on versus ex ante incentives. For example, like competition law is based on ex post evaluation, but it's there is a need to create more kind of like approaches or models for ex ante incentives as well. And then in the AI systems where there are complex networks of users, developers, procurers, and the responsibilities are not always clear, and it's quite difficult to define then in which places and who to regulate. And then one discussion and one initiative that we have seen emerging is related to regulatory sandboxes, which have the potential in this AI Act, for example, to bring together developers, users, academia, and regulators in a way that would enable then the sharing the information and experiences. And especially in AI case, then they form the basis for European excellence, as it says in the regulation. And generally, those sandboxes aim to increase understanding and anticipation of the regulatory boundaries and possibilities for the technology that is under development or already during the development process, and to tackle those challenges that were mentioned. And their plan to enable mitigation of negative impacts of the technology and then concretization of its possible range of implementation. And as said, we have seen a lot of different kinds of initiatives from the European Commission, World Economic Forum, and UK government have been like highly promoted those. And they are included also in the European AI Act. The criticism says that they seem like a more like kind of like add-on there with no so relevant tasks to make them truly relevant. Again, there are a couple of the questions which I'd like to hear your insight and views when we go to the discussion phase. So if these sandboxes are to be mainstream, what are their possibilities and hindrances, and how to make them truly relevant? And generally, are they more kind of a practical way of assessing legal and ethical shortcomings before implementing on AI on wider level and tackle those mentioned challenges, or merely a more like kind of neoliberal construction diminishing the power of public authorities? Then next, I would like Anna to go through the third a case example.
Yes, thank you. Right. So the third kind of perspective we would like to include in the discussion is this, are the initiatives and models towards more collaborative policymaking in the case of participation and co-design. And this is something that, Atte already mentioned our project to the Finnish Prime Minister's office. And we as a think tank, we work quite a bit with this, with different stakeholders, and kind of are very hands-on in different types of processes and projects where we develop new processes for governance with the governments quite closely also. So we have this, usually working quite a bit both for the kind of citizen inclusion perspective, and then also with governments, and try to figure out what kind of needs they have, and then also towards the private sector. So these are kind of everyday issues for us to be dealing with, which is why we would like to also raise the issue here. So maybe first, just very kind of the general level, maybe. These are the kind of processes that if you have like these different tools, like ethical frameworks, ethical assessment frameworks, and then you have these different regulatory tools like sandboxes, and what kind of processes and practice level things you will be meeting to actually realize their potential and to have use of them. And usually think about the experimental governance models. Like Professor Charles Sable has famously introduced his experimental government theory back in the day, and then also which in essence aim at kind of introducing innovative ways to include citizens, but also different stakeholders into policy-making processes and decision-making processes. And here at Demos, we've been, for example, discussing this humble policy-making process. I can show you a slide in a bit, which is a derivative of the experimental government model. And then also different approaches to co-design and participatory design processes have been now becoming a more mainstream thing, which then maybe emphasize more the citizen perspective, such as the ladder of participation model, for example. So just to show you an example from the humble governance model, the starting point would be to find a kind of a thin consensus. So first you find something that you can agree on, and then to have a process of devolved problem solving where you can involve different stakeholders to discuss and present solutions for different problematics and also state their views. Then have peer learning mechanisms in place where you can ensure that there's a feedback loop and you can come up with different solutions and have a correction of the process also in the way. And then have the revision of framework goals also in the end, where you can ensure that there will be a thicker consensus than maybe reached. But this is an application of the experimentalist governance theory. Yeah, and then this is an example from the Ada Lovelace Institute's participatory data stewardship. Just as I won't go into detail, but just to see that there are these different loops of how to have citizens included in processes so that we would have AI development, algorithmic development, and then different citizens groups brought together more closely. So there is, we look at having different gaps in different places, but ultimately the point being is how to have like an overarching strategy and then try to implement that in different contexts. And yeah, so these are some of the basic questions that you can already think about, and then we'll come back to these. Examples of the questions that can be raised in this context is, first of all, how to institutionalize this new AI governance processes that are less top-down, so that they won't kind of be just one-off, but you can apply them in different points in time. Then also how to find new ways of cooperating with actors outside the government, trying new incentive structures. So that's kind of the, if you think about the policymaking and governance perspective, but then other kind of public sector governance perspective. And then also how to allow for experimentation, failure, and learning by doing in a sensitive domain such as AI bias. Right.
Thank you, Anna. Yes, and as this was titled as workshop, and we are very interested in and curious to hear your comments, thoughts, ideas, insight into this topic that had quite many different kinds of dimensions and elements. First of all, it would be, of course, like we can. I think we are going to stay in this main room with all of us. We are such a suitable size of the group of people, and we could have the first kind of like general comments and ideas, and then we could discuss through these different case examples and initiatives that we went through, like about the bias in AI-based solutions, what should be taken account when creating a fairness or bias evaluation framework for AI generally, and then regarding the regulation and what kind of initiatives there should have, and if these presented regulatory sandboxes should they be mainstreamed, and then what are their possibilities and hindrances, and like kind of what is the nature purpose of them, and what are they really a practical way assessing those legal and ethical shortcomings, or more neoliberal construction. And then last discussion questions regarding these participatory processes that Anna presented, related to policy making, as well as these like participatory development processes, and how to put together scalable options for participatory AI governance, and who should be included in experimental governance at national level, and how to ensure linkages between ethical assessment frameworks and participatory practices. So quite a big list of big questions. So maybe we could start so that you could present like your initial thoughts and ideas, what came to your mind during this presentation.
And maybe just to add that we're sorry we weren't able to do this live. Things are how they are. We were supposed to be there in Munich, but we're not, obviously. So please feel free to, you can raise your hand, and then feel free to open your mic and just engage in the conversation in any way you like. But we would really like to hear your kind of first impressions, and then also experiences and views on this perspectives.
And anybody can start who is brave enough.
Sorry, I'm apparently unable to keep mine. There you go. No? No. There
we go.
Sorry.
Yeah, maybe we can take some time that you can think first individually, and then we can have a round and hear your views.
Yeah, and also actually, yeah. Hi, welcome.
Hello there. And I'm going to start just to warm up the whole team. But I think in terms of mitigation of the bias, that one of the first things need to be analyzed. We were discussing this in another talk today. There's basically need to be taken into account the cases that you're applying, because at some application you will have like really no need for applying any mitigation of the bias. So imagine that you're producing wood and you're trying to optimize the production, that you might not need any bias more than trying not to fire many people when you're like using a machine. So that will be my contribution on the first one.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I think it's central to really consider the use case. I'm not sure. Yeah, I suppose it doesn't necessarily have to be about human discriminatory biases, but it might be worthwhile to keep that mindset there, because the biases can also be related to just unoptimized kind of goal setting, which might then adversely affect the kind of functioning of the system, even if it doesn't discriminate against anyone. But yeah, that's certainly a case that it really starts from the use case, and it's very kind of use case dependent on what the risks might be. So yeah, that's a very good point.
Maybe just to add that this is actually one of the things that we've been discussing in our project for the Prime Minister's office, is that when you're creating a kind of evaluation framework, and then you're trying to figure out for whom exactly are you creating it for, so that ideally this would be really clear to and very easy to use for different actors, so that it would be applicable in several contexts. But then it may look very different, like depending on the responsibilities that the kind of even legal responsibilities that you have, but whether you're a state actor or whether you're a private sector actor, or whether you're, of course, we obviously want to have like basic human rights in place normally, and you would like to take the fundamental rights as the fundamental ethical considerations as the main starting point. But it's not so easy when you're trying to figure out what it is exactly that when you have a framework, and then you should have some sort of guidelines or some explanation of how to use that and how to apply to different actors, so that it's not too general, but it's also not too restrictive. And this is something that we're wondering about at the moment. So that we're still in the process of doing that. So we're discussing with the national government and different sectors over the fact.
Yeah, I mean, if you apply this theory that you're going to optimize the process in the way that you are like basing on case study, so then you can just concentrate more in some topics, or let's avoid maybe some time consuming in things that might not be needed, because it's not depending on the case study. You're going to have completely different application. You're going to have completely different ethical concerns. And also you're going to use completely different database or technologies, so that if you make a first filter in an initial stage, you can then later optimize the processes. So imagine that you're going to healthcare, you need to, let's say, you need to go through every standards that is going to go into ISO or DIN. And in that case, that you need to apply some of the regulation that are already in place. And in that case, you need to go deep into maybe accountability, or you need to go deep into privacy. But then again, in production, for example, or in data optimization, that you might not need that much of these analysis in these areas. So I think you make yourself a favor also the people that they don't need to go through a whole process that might not be applicable in many of the other cases.
Yeah, I think the scalability is a really good point, and it's also very much related to, say, the participatory processes, which can look very different in different stages, and obviously can be very time consuming. So there's not one size fits solution. So yeah, making that scalable is especially hard there, as we mentioned.
I think one of the things we didn't consider on the other discussion is basically to make it realistic, in terms of, because you want not to stop innovation, and then you want to keep on the process of, let's say, technology development. But then all these, let's call it bureaucracy, or let's say auditories, or, optimization, where the primary objective from the companies are not bias or are not basically like fairness, that's become kind of complicated if they're like really high time consuming, because it will become more a problem than an advantage for them. And it might hinder not only the innovation, but also the competition in the markets.
Yeah, one thing we've been kind of working on a different project is collaborating with other more technical researchers, this kind of taking the first steps in kind of embedding these kind of debiasing or bias mitigation tools into kind of machine learning operations. So having them be a bit more kind of embedded in the development process. So in that way, be very scalable. But that's still very much on the works, and we'll see how that works out. But I think that's the one example of having scaling up things from the developer perspective, which is very promising.
And I missed the first part of the discussion, but it's like, were you talking about MLOps actually as one of the tools probably for working in accountability, or which tools were you proposing? Because I might have missed it.
So yeah, I was just referring to MLOps, but in terms of this, what we just presented here, we didn't really delve into that. But yeah, we collaborate with some researchers who have a bit more expertise on MLOps and how debiasing tools might be embedded there.
Yeah, and this framework which we discussed, and as Anna said, is something that we are right now that discussing within it, and kind of like doing the very kind of initial background research for it, and then we will develop it during next spring. So we, and exactly because of these kind of reasons, it's of course not a simply task and the like national government here in Finland is they are looking for something usable framework for all the civil servants that they can then evaluate and so on to mitigate the risks when approaching with AI-based solutions.
Yeah, and actually, just one more thing about that project, and then maybe not so much about that, but one thing also that has become quite evident there is that this is actually one of the things that also got us into this topic in the first place, is that yes, they need something that they can apply here at the national level, because they need to take care of national legislation, obviously, and the Finnish Ministry of Justice is the main coordination there in the project. But then obviously they're quite interlinked with the European, you know how the European regulatory or the different levels of regulation go. So they at the same time need something which is then also adjustable or applicable to kind of still taking into consideration the EU level, which is fine, obviously, but then it's very different and context. I know that this context sensitivity is something that we always refer to, but it's always there. So it's also something that in Finland, for example, at the public sector, you have different levels of activities, let's say, in terms of how much they're applying certain AI or algorithmic solutions, for example, and then you need to look at the sectors and so on and so forth, and then figure out where they're at exactly, and then you need to think about the whole kind of like the European level discussion, where it is at, and then also what kind of specificities, if that's an English word, are there in the Finnish context. So it's quite of an interplay. And then at the same time, you can't get around the fact that they actually use something for it as their tool to advance with their kind of ambitions of mainstreaming this thinking also at the Finnish national level. And also really they're actually quite ambitiously trying to overcome this silo thinking and have this understanding across policy sectors which are dealing with these issues under their governance sector. So I think we have big discussions there to be had, but at least we have this. These types of events where you have different people from different backgrounds, so you can exchange views on how we should solve everything, basically.
And I guess it might be like completely different depending on the sector that you are like trying to discuss, because the governance level, the size of the company level, the maturity level in technology is completely different. So I don't want to monopolize the discussion between this room and me, but I don't know if does anybody want to talk about me and the team? Because if not, I will say something about the sandboxes, but I will leave a couple of seconds just in case somebody wants to jump in.
Yeah, if thanks a lot, Manuel, and let's go to sandboxes. But before that, maybe Laura, Johannes, Samuela, if anybody of you has any thoughts, that would be very good to hear. As Ellen reminded us, we can also use the chat function, but now if any one of you has any thoughts.
Maybe I can also jump in, because I recently was working on a project that investigated individuality and fairness in that case, public health surveillance tools. But here, I would add to the question of what should be taken into account when creating a framework for fairness, because I think we have different levels of parameters that we need to take into account when we talk about discrimination. At first, we have these kind of parameters that are definitely discriminative. So we all know them based on ethnicity or gender. So that's definitely non-negotiable, that they can be discriminative. But then I think we have another level, and they are, on the one hand, subjectively, so they are subjective, so you can discuss about whether they are discriminative or not. And they also change depending on time or maybe context. So for example, now in the COVID context, we have parameters like people being vaccinated or not. And we should also take into account whether systems are discriminative based on more characteristics than just the, let's say, non-negotiable characteristics and parameters that we usually take into account. So I think, to sum up, there are many, many more parameters than just the biasing and discrimination parameters, but when it comes to fairness, we need to see which parameters should be taken into account. And then in the end, look for fairness issues based on those parameters as well.
Yeah, I think something we've kind of run across is also the fact that, you know, with AI-based solutions, the legislative framework we have in place doesn't really work all that well, since it's more so based on kind of identifying specific characteristics based on which people are discriminated against. So, say being a woman in a workplace, whereas with AI-based solutions, they might be much more kind of gradual and intersectional based discrimination based on many different factors, and obviously also there's the kind of lack of transparency, so we oftentimes don't really have a good idea what might be the kind of factors which play into the decision. So it might be much more based on multiple factors, yet still leading to what might be considered discriminatory outcomes. So that's a very good point. Thanks.
Yes, is there from Samuel or Johannes, is there anything to add on this topic? If not, I think if we can then discuss about this regulatory sandboxes as well. If Manuela, you have some thoughts about those, or
and that's basically okay. I will say my short experience on that, because like I haven't like researched enough for 1 year. I'm making the research on one side in terms of measuring the explainability, accountability, and other items from ethics in AI. But also I'm trying to analyze the problem space in between businesses, legislation, and also ethics specialists, because I'm having like proven some hypotheses that actually ethics is not a priority in many of the companies that are like applying AI at the moment. And I was trying to look for the pain in between all of these items. And I was asking actually about sandboxes. And I got, having made plenty of interviews, and then last week I just got from one company that they were talking about the sandboxes, and I proposed them like, well, what do you think? Do you think it would be useful to use the sandboxes for your company? And they were highlighting a really interesting point in terms of practicality, where I was kind of fun in the beginning from the sandboxes, because I was finding like really useful in terms of collecting information and making pilots and gather know-how from the government side. But then a company came and say like, yes, but what is the advantage from my side? So what is basically what, if I have AWS or Google giving me tools that they're like good enough not to, let's say, not to use a sandbox, why I need to go through regulatory items, lose the time when I can concentrate and solve the problem on my own with these tools that are already available. And there was also some discussion when I passed this interview that there was also some critics about the sandboxes, if they're going to be like GDPR based one-on-one, or they're going to be able to jump maybe some of the GDPR just for the test phase, where the people can use in a really close environment, a test area where they can profit basically from this infrastructure. Because if not, that might be for many companies that they have already like a, let's say, SMEs or companies that are like big enough to have their own teams, maybe not worth it for them to go into sandboxes, but instead creating their own sandboxes in a way, or using the tools that are already available, and just speed up the process in implementation. And I found it like really interesting point, because I was thinking like it could bring really a lot, but then on the other side I was thinking like, oh, maybe regulatory sandboxes as they are right now on the EU regulation, they might not be so attractive. But I don't know what your findings are. So I will be really open to hear what you hear about the sandboxes or what you learn in your research process.
That's a very good point. I think, yeah, again, kind of like the context matter quite much. Like what I've heard about, like for example, this UK where they have like with financial authorities, the fintech companies were able then to test some new products and services with their consumers without having to meet these user requirement, like regulatory requirements. I don't know deeply about that, but at least that has been like praised as a kind of like good example of how in a certain context it might work. But I think that's a then relevant question, like which kind of then, like in which context then it is attractive for the companies and also kind of like the useful for the kind of regulators or for the societal point of view. Then about this blockchain regulation sandbox with the commission is planned. I think it's planning now, and that has been like not only about like if it's attractive, but the criteria has been criticized, that the criteria for entering to the sandbox are kind of like already playing out the most innovative startups or companies which exactly would need that kind of testing platform. And Atte has something to add.
No, I think well, first of all, it's really interesting to hear, and I think for the last point that Johannes made about the blockchain plans now, that I think this is a very interesting case in which is to show that whenever you're trying to create some sort of conditions and boundaries, and you're conditioning, you're kind of creating, whenever you put criteria in place, then you're always facing the choices of how to manage that interplay between inclusion and exclusion, and what kind of when it comes to such a thing as innovation and having the kind of very small companies there in the field who are doing a lot of work a lot of innovative work, then what kind of criteria are you going to be putting into place so that you actually allow access to those who would really need it, and where it would be really critical to have the first impressions of the potential risks and also regulatory hindrances that there might be, but also the kind of actual issues that may arise. So I think it kind of alludes that while the intention is pretty nice, so that you create like a controlled environment for testing something which you can't immediately approve of, then we're kind of in the constant problematics of trying to come up with the criteria and how to contextualize those and what kind of specifics there need to be in place, and who should be the kind of overall authority of what those criteria should be. I think there are overall, I mean, this goes to all of our examples pretty much, and this is one of my favorite topics as a political scientist, that I think one of the kind of key issues throughout the way is like the agency of things and responsibility of who is exactly doing what in these three fields. Because whenever we do, when we're talking about policy, or we're talking about kind of future-oriented things that we're trying to regulate and come up with strategies which are then reacting to the present, but then trying to aim at future kind of successes and mitigate failures, then we're always talking about the kind of who gets to decide and where and what kind of processes are put in place. It's kind of a very simple point to be made, but it's I can't get over the fact that I think it's quite a central one in many ways. And especially maybe in this field where you have a lot of actors from different sectors, and then you have a very strong contribution from the research communities, for example, as well. So we have different temporalities and different logics at play when you're trying to then synchronize and put together, I suppose. Not a very easy task.
Yeah, I feel like in practice, a lot of it comes down to how you actually frame it, because I've seen it kind of go both ways. So is it a regulatory sandbox for fostering innovation, testing new innovative solutions without some kind of, regulatory burden? Or is it more so a regulatory sandbox for testing different regulatory measures and ethical standards? And there's kind of different communities which approve of the other approach and different framing. So it's kind of a wordplay in a sense as well.
Yeah.
My fear is that there might be a risk of, based on what you say, basically on application, on the size of the company I was talking before, is that if there is these regulatory boxes, there might be like two kind of customers that, some of them, they will join them because they starting, they don't know, they need support, they might need to be guided, in terms of, incubator kind of for regulatory. But then you have also the other level of all the big companies, or and not call it big companies, but let's say a mid-size to big size, that they can have their own ethics chief, they can have their own development team, they can have their own investment in cloud services. And these kind of customers, they might not need these regulatory boxes, right? These sandboxes, they might say like, what for? And of course, it makes sense that everyone goes through these regulatory boxes, but I think, my battery is right now. I think that basically is that there might be like in GDPR, that people just, actually these sandboxes are also like being applied. I think they were like on European level also proposed in terms of GDPR. And if you have a sandbox in every country, and now by GDPR, not many people are using it, maybe a good analogy. Is that going to work just for AI systems or not? Is that, and of course, like, is every of the companies in healthcare, for example, are they not going to go to regulatory sandboxes? Well, they need to have advantages for that. And even though if it's a really, really good, because it will be really, really nice to use it, I have the feeling it's like when when you're unemployed and you go to the government unemployment system, and then the other people send the CVs on to the private companies, kind of this similar analogy for being used or not being used. And for the government, it's ideal that the people will use sandboxes, because the collection of information and the control and the learning and correcting will be great on the regulation. But if this will happen, I don't know, really, that's
Yeah.
But
yeah. Go ahead.
Did you make pilot, or are you using pilots where the people are like using kind of regulatory sandboxes, or do you know somebody who is like using it, and what is their experience, or you haven't gone that far?
Not really. Yeah. I don't have in mind any pilots, and then the discussion, I think, is, I say, like, I think that again, depending on the context, like, I think it has become in a way a bit kind of like buzzword for many different kinds of initiatives. Especially, I've been working here in Finland with again, AI project which has very, very different focus, like how then to what with kind of like policies we need in order to create a successful twin transition with the support of AI, like to support twin transformation with the support of AI. And they're actually the especially from the public servant side, the initiatives are very often regarding different kind of like data spaces and data sandboxes and different kind of like for companies to enable them to whatever, to collaborate, to do the innovation. And then actually when asking from the and involving with co-creating those things together with the companies, they have faced again like very same challenge what you mentioned, like they're like, okay, we actually have enough data. Actually, we wouldn't be interested in that kind of sandbox or anything. And then I think in this regulation case also, I think like these regulatory innovations, or like the scale should be somehow widened, and that the approaches should be developed. For example, there was like a few years back, I think there was like lots of discussion about performance-based regulation. Then that was not, I think it was a bit too challenging way to really like implement it. There were like some initiatives in Rwanda, for example, to utilize that approach, where the public sector creates standards, and the companies are then, or it creates goal, and companies and then are then able to work with like find the best ways to create that condition or that aim. But I think like kind of like widening the discussion from the sandboxes for different kind of innovations and different kind of processes which would work in different contexts would be beneficial for this discussion. Sorry, I went from your question to that, but I think we have only 2 minutes time left.
Yes.
Yeah, and I'll also mention that I think, yeah, it's manually mentioned Denmark. I think Norway also has something specific for artificial intelligence on regulatory sandboxes, and I don't know how it has went, but yeah, I think they had like 25 different firms apply and be part of it and so forth. So that might be one case to look at here in Nordics, but yeah.
Okay, but I think we're headed towards the end, and as it looks also from the people who are still here. So thanks everyone, and also kind of belated thanks to Manuel, who already dropped out. And thank you, Ellen, for helping us to host this session. And I hope everybody is having a wonderful event still continuing tomorrow. So thanks. I'll stop my screen sharing now.
Thank you. Also, I think Manuel lost his internet connection because the video was also stuck.
Okay.
But also thank you for the workshop, and yeah, I hope you enjoyed the conference so far, and we will see you soon in more sessions.